We discussed and the question was raised, what are the key priorities for the Ukraine in terms of the reforms? And you remember that there were two important reforms which were indicated as the key for Ukraine. And among them were two reforms in healthcare and pension reform. Last year, under the pressure of the parliament, government agreed to launch the second pillar reform started from 1st of January 2019. So a year was given to set up necessary infrastructure. Two initiatives were developed separately by the regulator, the State Commission on Securities and Stock Market, and by the deputy. So we're here to discuss what are the key features and parameters of this concept and whether Ukraine is ready to the reform. Because in May of this year, on a heel of the voting of the bill in a parliament, IMF and World Bank expressed warning in a joint letter to the parliament that Ukraine still is not ready for the reform and it should be postponed. To give you an understanding, I would like to stress that necessary infrastructures were set up in 2 or 3 more than 15 years ago, and in any year after 2 or 3, second pillar could be launched, but all the time was postponed. And finally, what we can see that our neighbors like Armenia and Georgia launched second pillar reform this year, given just a 4-year for the preparation of the reform. So we just start from the Roman, who is one of the author of this law, who gave a quick introduction. What are the key features of the proposal? Roman, please.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. I think that if today we're speaking about a very important and sensitive topic which concerns all of the citizens of Ukraine, it's important to mention what page we are now at. The first, we need to understand that Ukraine has a couple of words about demographic first. So, we are now in the situation when approximately 12 million of working people who are paying the unified social investment are about for 11 with something pensioners. All of the European nations are getting older, and Ukraine is not an exclusion. So, according to different demographic forecasts, the situation will even worsen, but all of this story is speeding up with a colossal labor migration. Because Ukraine tries to overcome this labor migration since the 90s, and it's even difficult to calculate the scale of migration. But the non-visa regimen has not only positive but negative factors which influence economy. This is the labor force leak. And of course, the de-shadowing of black and grey wages should be working too. If we're speaking about the pension reforms, though we have financial reforms, we can't help speaking about the social component. As it was already mentioned in the introduction speech, Ukraine has conducted certain changes in the pension legislation, which the government names a pension reform, which concerned only the first level, and aimed for several points. First of all, recalculation of the pensions. Secondly, stabilization of the deficit of the pension fund. Because for today, the state budget of Ukraine covers the deficit of the pension fund, and this is the biggest expenses article after the external debt. So just for you to understand, there is an indicator which defines the capability of pensions. This is the ratio of pensions to the wages or salaries. In Ukraine, it's 28%. There are multitude of international documents which witness that if this ratio goes less than 40%, then there can be social disruption. If it goes lower than 30 or 25%, the country has the threat of national security without any exaggeration. So after the changes in the pension legislation last year, this ratio is still 28%. Moreover, there is the tendency, different modeling, and I'm trying to look at the calculations of the World Bank and the modeling. There is the tendency to say that every year this ratio will go lower. Moreover, people who are 35, 40 years now, their pension, if I may say, if nothing changes, will be, in fact, 17, 18% of this ratio. And even this, for your understanding, does not show the full picture, because an average pension in Ukraine is more than 2,500 hryvnia, but more than 55% of the people don't get this pension. A bit less than 3 million of people, in fact, get the pension which is less than 2,000 hryvnia. Just for you to understand the situation and what will happen. Secondly, it's also a characteristic, the quality of the work with the public finance. I will repeat, because in this solidarity system, the budget dotates to the pension system. Unfortunately, this task, which was aimed by the government, and which was mentioned in the requirements on the cooperation with the IMF, which is the stabilization of the deficit of the pension fund, the government last year gave a 3-year budget resolution where this figure had to be at the same point of 139 million hryvnia, but in the draft of the budget for the next year, 2019, which the government gave several weeks ago for the budget of the next year, this figure is increased enormously. And in this draft, the deficit is 165 billion. Moreover, there are all of the reasons to say that the deficit of the pension fund will increase not only in the absolute figures, but also in connection with the GDP. And also, the situation is influenced that lots of categories of the citizens, in fact, have to manually recalculate the pensions. Out of more than 12.5 million pensioners, we have half a million of so-called military pensioners. This is a substantial figure because Ukraine is a post-colonial state, and the parliament still does not have a law draft, governmental law draft, which would regulate this issue. There's lots of taxes of the taxpayers, and the pensions for the military, which should be higher than average. So, dear colleagues, when we want to have a discussion when we should have the second pillar, very often we hear that we are still not ready. And again, in the introduction, it was mentioned that there were remarks again of the International Monetary Fund and our other foreign partners Ukraine is cooperating with. But the real practice shows that delaying, as far as I investigate this situation since 2007, the work on the development of this pillar is taking place since even 1997. And it tells us that maybe Ukraine will never have the perfect time to implement it. So we shouldn't delay this issue. We don't have any time. The Parliament has several legislation initiatives, well, at least one of them is very articulate. There are certain debates around it, but my feelings as a parliamentary guy that the government and the profile line ministries are not ready to implement this or that model. Unfortunately, there are all of the risks that in 2019, which will have 2 elections, the situation will be delayed and postponed again. What can we expect What are my expectations out of the second pillar implementation? First of all is the social effect. In the short-term perspective, it seems to me it's really important, whatever the model is, which is implemented by Ukraine, it's important to have the payments during the first year. It's important, well, we mean, if, for instance, in the case of death, or it's important for this money to be paid to the families, because it's really important to construct, to develop trust in Ukraine, because lots of discussions in Ukraine depend on the trust to the banking sector and to the state. So it's important for those payments to take place since the first year. It would mean that every year Ukraine would have several hundred of thousands of people which would have a positive or a success story of the work during the second pillar implementation. But the aim, of course, in the long-term and even medium-term perspective, according to different calculations, for 2045, 2050, to get the ratio of 40%. The replacement or rate of 40% and higher. The economic effect, according to the law draft, which is registered in the Parliament, number 6677, it's not perfect, but still, according to that model, if the Parliament approves it, adopts it, how it exists now, the economic effect will be 20 million hryvnia during the first year, and in fact, the speeding up till 2050 to the planned increase of the GDP could be plus 25% and can form 16 trillion hryvnia. Well, of course, for the economy of Ukraine, it's a very powerful driver which would influence for the overall development. I'm speaking for too long, yes, I have to be short a bit, okay. So the last point then we'll have a discussion. I would repeat again, the calculations per capita is very important. According to the law draft which we have now, that if we're modeling that the person retires in 2050 and gets the pension for 20 years more, then this sum will be 2 million hryvnia, and the person who is retiring, this replacement will have the ratio or replacement ratio of 40%. And altogether, that to the solidarity pillar and the second pillar, this person will get approximately 16,000 hryvnia. There are lots of risks, discussions, fears, so I'm giving the floor to other speakers not to keep you for too long. Romane, I would like to ask you, well, of course, there are two law drafts. There is one law draft. Okay, one registered law draft and the other one which is at the stage of the future registration. From the point of view of your law draft, why is it better? First of all, I will tell you as a parliamentary person, from the internal cuisine so-called thing, if it's not registered, it's still a concept. When we see the second law draft, then we'll have two law drafts. I'm not an author of the first legislation initiative. My colleague Yuri Solovey is an author, who is the main co-author of this law draft. There are two huge discussions about this law draft. The first one is the size of the rate. Because of the calculation, what will the unified social investment consist of? Because the first year has 2%, and then gradually it is increased to the 7%. The second discussion is that this level will work only for the people who are 35 and less. And this is the second discussion, which is a very important one. It seems to me it's a very doubtful norm. It's very important to begin for all of the age categories, for people to get payments even during the first year of the second pillar implementation, in spite of the model which is adopted, for us to have a positive effect of trust and formation of culture of accumulation. It's important for effect for Ukraine. And this third model and point of debate, what's the form of the state in that? This is a centralized model or decentralized model, out of what I see of the second so-called law draft, as you say it. Thank you. Alexander.
I'd like to touch your concept as we see a bit, I would say, a difference in the meaning, because it's not still a draft law, but a concept. So the draft law was passed to the parliament last year, but as we understood, US regulator was not satisfied with this law, draft law. So the question, why, and why you decided to develop the new concept, which might bear the risk of the certain contradiction in the parliament.
Okay. Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. Well, really, when we looked at the law draft which was presented by the MPs, we understood that it does not have lots of substantial points which have to be mentioned there. The law draft about the implementation of the second pillar has to be conceptual from the point of view of the changes of regulation and changes of the conditions of existence of the accumulations. So when we saw that this law draft does not contain all of that, we began the development of our own law draft, and now I will present it to you, the main principles which it includes. I will have the presentation in English. It has been developed for the conference for our foreign colleagues, so I will speak English if you don't mind.
Let's switch to English, and I will present our concept in my short presentation. Okay, first of all, how it works. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So first of all, what is the background of introduction of mandatory accumulated pension system? As Roman mentioned, we have a very difficult situation with pension fund Ukraine. We have a huge deficit that is around 45%. That is the amount for previous year. We have around 12 million pensioners in Ukraine, and the replacement rate currently it's around 35%. We also have a third pillar, but the amount is small here. It's pension assets. It's around 2.5 billion hryvnias. It's in euros. It's 78 million euros, and we have only 840,000 of participants. So we see that this situation is not suitable for Ukraine, and we need to improve the mandatory accumulation pension system. After this, we have made the overall assessment with IOPS principles, and we realize that we are doing according to principles only with one. It's objectives. Our objectives is clear, and the rest is not. And we have a huge problem with resources, with powers, with risk orientation, with proportionality and sustainability. And we need to do, before we'll improve the system, we need to do the homework with this. So as a result, we have the following. We need to consolidate the supervision and control of the pension service providers in SSMC. We need to increase the institutional capacity of regulator. And finally, we need to introduce the mandatory funded pension system. What is the basic frame of the Pillar 2 system? We propose a centralized model. In the center, we have accumulated fund, and around we have the service providers. And what is the main functionality? We have the supervisory board, and the main functions: consideration of reports from asset management companies, custodian banks, then analysis of portfolio results and benchmarking, then approval of accounting policy of accumulated fund, and providing general control of the system. Administrative office will do the daily analysis of effectiveness for investing funds, made accounting, made the NAV calculation, calculation of pension units value, and the daily control and allocation of expenses between pension portfolios. Pension fund in Ukraine would be a front office for the Pillar 2 system. Would be provided personalized accounting. Would plan of pension payments, providing pension payments, and daily calculation of the quantity of pension units. Okay. The law that was prepared by the Commission is about comprehensive system requirements. It's very complex. And what we are talking about in this law is we improve the additional requirements for service providers, for core functions, for risk management, for compliance, for internal audit, internal control. We improve the three types of portfolios. It's conservative, balanced, dynamic, and for different type of pensioners, they can choose different types. And we strictly limit the cost of the system. At the level on 0.5% of NAV is for asset management, for the administrative functions, for the custody services, for everything. And only separately we have 0.1% for the administrative office cost. Separately, we propose the same limitations as we have in another law. It is 3.5% if anybody chooses the not the accumulated fund, but he would like to be in the non-government pension fund. And as we understand, it's not all of the people will choose the pension portfolio in this system, and we think it will be 2% or 5% only. So the biggest part of citizens should choose will not choose the portfolio. That's why we propose automatic distribution such persons between the portfolios. Okay, and what is about our goals? We need to propose the relevant replacement ratio, and our calculation shows the following: that if we'll have the performance at the level of 2% per annum, and after 2025 it's 0.5%, we'd have the following: that's if the contribution would be 7%, we'll receive the replacement rate 10% for men and 73% for women. And if it's 10%, it would be 13 and 9 and 9 and 8 for women. And only if we have 15% contributions, we will reach the goal, even we'll have the replacement rate at the level of 20% and only for men. For women, it would be 14. What about rate of contributions? We proposed the initial rate should be 2%, and then we start to increase it. Increase on 1% annually, but only if the average wage will increase more than 5%. And maximum level of rate we propose 15%. And only in this situation we think we understand that we'll have the human-rated system that's connected to welfare of Ukrainians. Okay, so this graphic demonstrates what would be the difference if we will have different kind of fees in the fund. We take the maturity years, it's 30, and net performance 1.5, monthly contribution 1,000, and fund fees is 0.5% that we proposed in our law. And another alternative variant is it's 3.5% that we have in another law proposed by parliaments. So and you see that on the graphic that the difference are huge. That average cost, if we have 0.5% of fees, it generally would be 7 and 60%. And if you have 7.5, it's 40%. 40% people will pay for the service providers. Would you like to have such system? I think the answer is clear. So, as a result, we think that we will propose a win-win system for everybody who will be involved in this system. First of all, for citizens, we have a convenient and understandable system created in the interest of citizens, but not for intermediaries. We'll have a single window for providing services. will have the elimination of corruption risks for employers. Employers will not choose a pension portfolio or service providers for the employees. High quality of service for active members. Increase the personal savings and increase of replacement rate. For the government, we'll have a full reformed three pillars pension system, improvement of citizen pensions, and attract large-scale long-term investment. Lowering the interest rate as a result, optimization of expenses of state for maintain this system, and possibility to use the existing infrastructure of personality accounting of citizens, and strong regulator on the stock market. Thank you very much. That's all about.
Thank you, Alexander. We definitely see that the proposed model seems to be more cost-effective. The only problem that we know theoretically, by the way, but in practice in Ukraine, that's state, I would say, regulation, less cost-effective at the end. Taking into account that there are going to be two initiatives which will go to the parliament, and we already know that there are many other important initiatives stuck in the parliament. So if there are going to be two, that reduces the chances of the initiatives to be voted. Do you see any chances for you, like regulator and deputies, to consolidate your efforts in terms of the development joint draft?
Of course, Roman think more deeply knows all the procedures in Rada, how the laws going on to vote. But we cannot have the situation when we have two laws in Rada about one matter. So we need to think about consolidation, and we are open for this discussion, and we are open to do it together. We also understand that there's not enough political will at the moment for the voting, so also we need to take on the board the president, the cabinet ministry, everybody around it, and we need to move it forward together.
Thank you. We've been witnessed that in many European countries, the second pillar reforms were diminished or reversed. And actually it worries Ukraine because this raised an issue whether the second pillar reform can deliver expected results. And as we can see in many countries, it doesn't. So what is the reasons behind that, and does it mean that second pillar is not able to solve the problem which Ukraine faces at the moment? You have a vast experience in that, so can you explain briefly whether we need to worry?
Okay, so it's my turn, I believe. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to this event. It's a bit challenging to talk about the experience of reforms and reversals in 10 minutes for 8 countries. If you are interested in the details, we have a research report, 100 pages on that, and I will be covering the findings. So it's not only my research, but my colleagues from Warsaw School of Economics and the University of Gdańsk. So basically, maybe a couple of words about why the funded pillars were introduced in the countries. I have to switch probably. Can I have this one? So first of all, I should stress that the pension reform was not about the introduction of funded pillars. The pension reform was in most of those countries in 1990s and until 2000. It was about reforming the whole pension system, which was dealing with the retirement ages, with the indexation, with the benefits valuation, with the all parametric things, and sorting out the pay-as-you-go pillars. In a couple of countries like Poland and Latvia, the pay-as-you-go system, the solidarity system, was converted to a so-called NDC, so it works like as if it was the real money. The only difference is that there is no real money, but it's treated as if there is real money. In Romania, the system was introduced as a points-based system. And I dare to say, as you can see from the slide, but probably you can't see much, but basically all of those countries, the 8 countries, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, they were introducing the funded pillars. And the purpose was, I would say there were 3 purposes. One purpose was to diversify the risk in terms not to be fully dependent on the labor market in the future. When I will get retired, part of my savings, part of my retirement will come from my own money. The second purpose was, which somebody might say it's secondary, but it's also important, was to develop the local capital markets, or to strengthen the local capital markets by introducing the domestic institutional investors, such as pension funds. The third purpose was to make people aware that the pensions are not growing on the trees, that you have to save money to get the pension. That might sound obvious, but I would say that probably in many countries it was a problem. People did not understand that the pension has to be financed. So the funded pillars was something extra. The reality was that the introduction of the pillars offered too much to the people. When you ask the marketing companies to do the advertisement, the expectations were set very high. People were expecting they will be retiring at luxurious, warm countries, going, visiting, and which is not true. Now, when you look at each country's solution, it was different in a way that the initial contribution rate for the funded pillar, as you are discussing whether it should be 2%, 7%, 15%, in various countries it was different. For instance, in Poland it was 7.3%. In Estonia it was 6%, but in some other countries it was, for instance, around 2%, and the assumption was it will be growing. What is the typical pattern for all those countries? That in practically all countries but Estonia, the contribution rate was set up as a part of the funded pillar. So it was saying, okay, 7%, we will lower the 7% by 7% the contribution in the solidarity pillar, and the 7% will go to the funded pillar. Immediately, it means that the state has the obligation, has to pay the ongoing pension benefits, which means they have to find the money for the time being. When we will be retiring, it will be fine. We will be using these savings. But for the time being, the current pensioners, they have to get their pensions, and the state has 7 percentage points less contribution. So it creates so-called transition debt. How to finance the transition debt? The idea was, well, we have 3 sources. One is the pension savings in the system. You can do something, you can make people work longer, you can eliminate the privileges. You don't have to have military, for instance, retiring at the age of 40, which was sometimes the case. You can do parametric reforms. The second source, you can increase the taxes. You can have a special tax for to counterfight the effects in the social security system. And the third was you can simply increase the debt. Also, in a couple of countries like Poland, there was an assumption that we will privatize our national property, and this money will be used for financing the transitory debt. And now the question to the public is, did it work out? Unfortunately, not really. So it means that over those 10, 15 years, depending on the country, the transition debt was growing, and it was financed mostly by increased national debt. It was financed by issuing treasury bonds. So, for instance, in Poland, the transition debt over 12 years was around 16% of the GDP, because that was the amount of the contribution sent to the funded pillar. The problem that seems not to be the issue for Ukraine is that if you do the extra contributions, you don't have this transition debt, but then you have the impact on the labor market, because the people might say, well, the cost of the labor is even higher. And now I'm going to the reversals, maybe finally. The main reason for the reversals was not that the returns were low, even though in some countries they were. It was more about the fiscal difficulties which resulted from the financial crisis. And simply speaking, in the context of European Union, there was some peculiar effect because the governments were desperately looking for the financing. For instance, the deficits, they rose from, let's say, 2-3 percentage points to 7-10 percentage points. The government had to find money. Where's the money? Oh my God, here's a lot of money in the pension funds. So, of course, you might say that's not good for the future of the retirement system, but if you have a fire in the house as a Minister of Finance, then you have a look at the savings. And what was the problem of the Central European countries being members of the European Union was that the Stability and Growth Pact was not helping very much the governments to treat the pension savings as savings. So the problem was the following from the position of the Minister of Finance. We have a huge pension debt because of this transition. So we have more treasury bonds in the market. Our debt is higher. This is debt. The European Statistical Office will say this is definitely a debt, public debt. On the other hand, you might argue, well, but we have savings, and these savings in the future will be used to finance the retirement. So the state in 20, 30, 40 years' time will have much easier situation because part of the pension expenditures will be already self-financed by the people who save the money. That looks like assets. No, it didn't. The problem was that the European statistics was not treating these assets as assets on the grounds that this is the private property and on the grounds that the individual pension fund members are exposed to the risks. So basically, it created a very powerful incentive for the finance ministers to say, well, so if I take the money from the funded pillar, use it, I will assume the future pension liabilities for the social security part, the debt will disappear. My statistical level of debt will get lower. Of course, there will be some more debt under the carpet, the implicit pension debt, but it's not visible by the European statistics. So that explains why the funded pillars were treated as a kind of skarbonka, as a kind of safety net for the ministers. When you look at the costs, when you look at the returns, of course there were plenty of issues at the macroeconomic level, but that was not the real reason for the governments to reverse. And just maybe a few words about what was the type of the reversals. Well, basically, some of the governments, like in the Baltic states, they decided to freeze the contributions. They said, okay, for the time being, we are not putting money in the funded pillar. Later, they decided to come back to the situation as before. Some of the countries, and this is the case of Hungary and Poland, decided to either reverse it totally or partially. So in Hungary, the whole assets in 2014, I believe, 2012, they were moved to the state. In Poland, we had the situation that the contributions were lowered, and at some point, the treasury bonds part of the portfolios was retired, so the assets were reduced, and now we have the contribution rate which is lower. So we have something like the government can do something with the assets, the government can do something about the level of the contributions. The third option, the third reaction was also to make the funded pillars voluntary. So you can introduce some very smart solution that a default option for the newcomers in the labor market will be, if you don't say anything, you will be in the unfunded pillar. You will not go to the funded pillar. So I will invite you to have a look at the tables at the presentation later on. But basically speaking, what is the main, I would say, conclusion of this story is the erosion of trust. I would say the highest cost of that is not that my pension will be higher or lower, rather lower in result of that. The highest problem is that Now the governments are talking about introduction of voluntary pillars, for instance, in Poland. It's a problem. The other issue is that when you substantially reduce the role of the funded pillar, it has the impact on the local financial network, because, for instance, the stock exchange might suffer. The ability of the local treasury bonds market to adapt to potential shocks becomes weaker, because then the share of the other institutional investors, usually foreign investors, increases. The domestic investors, as pension funds, is getting marginalized. So that's the issue. Obviously, we are talking about the pensions here today, but it's a very complicated issue, because it's linked to the labor market, it's linked to the financial markets, it's linked also to some kind of societal issues. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Okay, may I ask a question? From your experience, is the second pillar is an appropriate instrument to increase the replacement rate in the long term? Because this is the major issue Ukraine is facing at the moment, and it's been considered like a solution for that. What do you think? Is it right, and is this untimely? I mean,
I would say that in principle, yes, people should be saving. It has a really good effects on various aspects of life, and it stimulates the growth, the economy. Even if you argue that on the net basis the savings are not increasing at the national level, you still have some secondary externalities, positive effects. But you should look at that as a combination of. I would strongly suggest that you cannot look only at the funded pillar. Unfortunately, all our nations have the problem with the liabilities which have to be met, liabilities towards the current retirees, towards the people who will be retiring in 5, 10, 20 years' time. So I would say, basically, you have to reform both pillars. Introduction of the funded pillar only is not going to help. You have to combine. You have to say, okay, what am I going to do with these commitments by the state that had been already developed towards the current pensioners and the future pensioners in the next. And maybe also one more remark, it's a little bit at the micro level. I would also discourage, there was a lot of discussion about the trust that people should be saving. That's in general, in principle, I agree, but you have also to bear in mind that if you encourage people to participate in the funded pillar, be it mandatory or voluntary, and people say at the age of 60 will join, and they will be saving for 3-5 years, they will be very disappointed, because they will say, look, I don't have much money. You will have some press releases after a couple of years saying this guy got 20 cents per month as a pension if you decide to have life annuities. So I would say this should be probably a process which should be focused on the current young generation rather than at the whole nation, because it will create some undesired psychological effects, I would say. But in principle, obviously, anything that helps you to save for the retirement is a good thing. Thank you.
thank you.
May I ask also a question?
If you don't mind, I will give the floor to the other speakers, and then you can ask. Actually, I suppose you did have time yesterday to ask any questions to the panel, because we met already a few times. I'm kidding. Nikola, I know that your study included, I would say, pension reforms in many countries. Which lessons can be taken into account introducing the reform of the second pillar in Ukraine? What should you focus on when you do that?
Thank you very much, Grigoriy. It's a big pleasure to be here and a privilege. And since I only have 10 minutes to play the devil's advocate role, I'll jump straight to the point. So, okay. Yeah. Okay, so these are the 11 Eastern European countries that have introduced the second pillar over the last 2 decades. And you can see that in 10 out of those 11 countries, we have seen reform reversals. Now, this picture alone tells you that there is something very wrong in second pillar in Eastern Europe. The reform reversals basically went from dismantling the second pillar only 1 year after it was introduced in Czech Republic, to dismantling more than a decade after it was introduced in Hungary, and to almost dismantling in Poland, as Dariusz said. And besides this dismantling of the second pillar, we have also seen many examples of significant reduction in the second pillar by reducing the second pillar contribution rate significantly in countries like Slovakia, Latvia, Lithuania. And the most recent trend that we are seeing right now in countries like Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia is that the legislators are changing the laws and allowing the workers to return from the second pillar to the first pillar because they realize they will have a larger pension in the first pillar than if they stay in the second. And as we speak, Croatian government is adopting the law to allow more than 97% of second pillar participants to return to the pay-as-you-go system because it was estimated that they will have higher pension in the pay-as-you-go system. So I will try to draw 3 lessons on why this disappointing performance in second pillar in Eastern Europe occurred. The first lesson is about political economy. And it's really simple. The pension reform should be about pensioners, period. It has nothing to do with economic growth, with development of markets, with reducing shadow economy. Unfortunately, if you look at the processes in Eastern Europe, when pension reforms were being discussed, most of the talk was actually about how second pillar introduction will help you increase economic growth, increase national savings, even combat shadow economy because supposedly workers will now be voluntarily willing to pay taxes because they will have so much trust in the second pillar. And in a large part of the responsibility for this lies actually in this influential and highly controversial World Bank study that actually put forward its claims. Now, as economists now see, this was nothing more but basically lobbying. Now there is firm evidence that second pillar did not increase economic growth or help combating shadow economy in any of the reforming countries. So you need to focus on pensioners because remember we are all pensioners sooner or later and look at their benefits. Don't look at this supposed side benefit of economic growth because this will not happen. Now one thing that many lobbyists in Eastern Europe got wrong is that they were thinking that it's enough to get political support to introduce the second pillar and that's it, you're set for life. Well, you're not. You have to maintain that political support for the next 50 years while these pension funds mature, because if you don't maintain that support, if you don't introduce the second pillar on valid economic grounds that will actually benefit the people, then the political momentum will change, and then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from the introduction, you will see a reversal that you are now seeing in Eastern Europe. Now, moving from political economy to public finance. Lesson number 2 is do not carve out second pillar from the pay-as-you-go system. If you look at developed countries in Western Europe, in North America, private pension system in all those countries basically are supplementary pension system. They are on top of the existing public pension systems. Only in Latin America and Eastern Europe, this controversial idea of carving out the private pension pillar from the pay-as-you-go system was introduced. Now, when you carve out the second pillar from the first pillar by basically diverting pension contributions to the second pillar, you create a massive deficit in the public system and in the government budget. Chile managed to cover this deficit with the support of Pinochet regime, and they managed to have huge surpluses for decades. But enabling those surpluses in a kind of Eastern European or in a democratic setting, it's much harder. So many reforming countries in Eastern Europe actually failed to implement these austerity measures and to close down the deficit that second pillar introduced. So what happens if you introduce the second pillar and you don't close down the deficit that it introduced? So this is what happens. So first you have a simple pay-as-you-go system where you take the money from workers, governments collect it and distribute it to pensioners. Now you have a second pillar. You divert those contributions to the second pillar, but you don't close the gap in the government. So the government now doesn't have the money to pay out pensions. So now the government is taking the money from the second pillar in order to pay out pensions. So this kind of second pillar, it's not really pension privatization. This is basically circular transactions and basically pay-go financing in disguise. Now, not only is this pay-go financing in disguise, but this is also inferior to pay-go finances because, as Dariusz says, this increases your budget deficit, this increases your public debt, and this also decreases the value of your pensions because it is well known that private pension funds charge very high fees in all countries. And one of the rare virtues of the pay-as-you-go system is actually it has low costs. So this was the case actually in many countries. In Hungary, Poland, Argentina, 60% of second pillar portfolios was in government debt. In Croatia and in Romania, it's even worse now, it's 70%. So it's obvious that if you have this situation, the government will have an incentive to do what basically Poland did, to close down these circular transactions, to go down to a simple pay-as-you-go system. Now, you might think that this will not be an issue for Ukraine because at face value, Ukraine is not planning a carve-out pension privatization. What formally Ukraine is planning is to increase the second pillar contributions without reducing the first pillar contributions. But if you remember what happened in 2006, when you had a drastic cut in the first pillar contributions that left big deficit that is going to stay for decades in the public pension system. So if you take a reference point as 2015, then Ukrainian plans are exactly to carve out the second pillar contribution. And I would say that this is a very likely outcome if Ukraine goes with the second pillar now. Now, if this actually happens, then in 15 years or so, there will be a political opportunity to do three things at the same time. Reduce public debt, reduce budget deficit, and increase pensions by doing basically the Polish type of reform reversal. Now my question to you is, how many Ukrainian politicians will find this idea appealing? Or how many politicians in any country will find this idea appealing? This is something that you need to think of now, not in 15 years. But coming to my last lesson is that suppose that against all odds, Ukraine somehow manages to avoid these circular transactions and gets the second pillar without them. There have been certainly cases of second pillar introduction in Eastern Europe that was introduced in fiscally prudent manner where these circular transactions were basically avoided. And these are the Baltic countries, Bulgaria and Slovakia. So let's look at the performance in those countries. Now, you know that the basic advantage of funded pillar over a pay-as-you-go system is that it should allow for higher pensions than the pay-as-you-go system. The pay-as-you-go system basically can allow the workers to have an implicit rate of return equal to GDP growth. Now, it has been established in all developed countries that capital returns are higher than GDP growth, so the funded pillar should allow the workers to have high rates of return than GDP growth. But look at what happened in these 5 countries. In all 5 countries, the rate of return on a funded pillar is significantly lower than rate of GDP growth. So basically, the funded pillar were basically giving the workers less than what they have been earning in a pay-as-you-go system. And that's why all these countries decide to reduce the second pillar, because the most obvious example is Latvia. Latvia has this NDC system where people in the first pillar earn the rate of return equal to GDP growth, And the second pillar, they're earning negative real rate of return. They're losing money. So it's obvious that all this reduction in the second pillar were actually benefiting the pensioners. Now, if you look at the literature and try to explain how come this came about in Eastern Europe, because by looking at the standard economic textbook, this is not what you should be seeing. You should be seeing that the returns to capital are higher than GDP growth. And in Eastern Europe, they're not. So if you look at the literature, many authors try to explain this perverse outcome by basically pointing to unsupportive precondition in developing countries in Eastern Europe. Some say it's the undeveloped local markets. Some say it's lack of supervisory capacity. Some say it's lack of financial literacy. Okay, so if this is the right explanation of why we are seeing this disappointing performance, then that must mean that the second pillar on mandatory individual accounts are working great in the developed countries, where these unsupporting preconditions are not present. So let's find a developed country that has a well-established mandatory individual account system. Well, it turns out that this is almost impossible to do, because the mandatory individual account system has been dismissed in basically all developed countries. There was a big push in the United States under George W. Bush to introduce them. It was dismissed in the United States. It was dismissed in Canada, France, Germany. Entire Western Europe basically dismissed mandatory individual accounts idea. Now, you might hear that mandatory private pension funds work very well in countries like Switzerland or Netherlands. That's true, but those private pension funds are completely different. They are not individual accounts, they are collective pension funds, defined benefit systems that provide much better support to workers than the defined individual accounts. So basically, the only developed country that has mandatory individual accounts is Australia. So let's see whether Australia is managing to get good performance out of the individual accounts. And one very interesting thing about Australia is that before Australia introduced individual accounts in '92, they had a very developed system of occupational pensions. So it's very instructive to compare the performance of occupational pensions and individual accounts in Australia. And as you can see, the occupational pensions, which you might hear from many reformers in Eastern Europe, are seen as supposedly not good for workers because it's the employers who choose the asset allocation and supposedly they don't care about the workers. You can see that the performance of occupational employer not-for-profit funds was vastly superior to retail individual accounts in Australia. And what is even more striking is that people are not switching from those retail funds, which are having very low performance compared to occupational funds. Despite the fact that Australia is one of the most financially literate countries in the world, these people, 40% of Australians almost, are not switching to not-for-profit funds, which would allow them almost twice as high pension. So this tells you that in the individual accounts and pension markets, there are serious cases of market failures, and free competition and free choice don't provide good outputs and good results in an individual account framework. And here it boils down to marketing or on companies attracting the contributors. And it was estimated in Chile, for example, that the marketing elasticity was 19 times higher than the price elasticity. So basically it was all about marketing. Now, correcting for this market failure
Nikola,
is very hard.
you see that?
Yes. And my last point is that the only way to try to correct for this is to try to go with this default life cycle portfolio that you have in Sweden. And I'll conclude at that and continue after.
Yeah, that answers the questions why the pensioners should be put first in any case, and definitely answered the question why the capital market should be developed prior to the launch of the second pillar in order to save the value of the savings. Thanks for that. And from the regulator point of view, Ambrogio, what is the missing point? Because we say that the issue is really, really complicated. To make it simple, what would you advise to do, just in a few words, if you are given a chance to start the reform here in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to comment on the prospects in Ukraine of pension funds. Well, actually, I must say that I do share a number of comments that were made, and just to make something that I believe is very much in line of what Nikola was saying. Let's show my slide that I. Yeah, okay. So this is very, very relevant for what Nikola was saying. This describes the Italian experience for supplementary pension plans. Italy is really a kind of case study in terms of how individual accounts can work, and because it gives example both of individual accounts that do work and work very well, and also individual accounts that do not work. And basically the difference is actually in the fiduciary role that is played by employers. So we have two kinds of individual accounts in Italy. The kind that works, we call occupational funds. They are based on individual accounts, defined contribution, but there is a kind of centralized role, a level of industry. So it's not the whole country, as in the project that you have for Ukraine from the State Commission of Securities, Supervision of Securities Markets, but it's a kind of similar. So it is the employers of specific sectors, of the steel industry, of the chemical industry, that manage the pension funds at the level of the industry, together with the representatives actually of trade unions, and they negotiate the mandates to asset manager to manage actually the funds, to make portfolio management and choice of investment strategy. And you see the results. This is a graph, this is a slide that shows you on the x-axis the dimension of funds, and on the y-axis the level of costs. And the ones that are, let me see if I can point, maybe this one. If you can see the line that is just in the lower right area, those are the funds at industry. Those are the industry funds where the employer plays this fiduciary role. So the level of costs is around 0.5% of assets under management, and this is actually a very good situation. The Italian market was basically created at the beginning of year 2000, so it is about 15 or 18 years that is in place. So you can see what is the situation after a number of years. So you can think about how the Ukrainian system may develop in this kind of time framework. All the other points that you see that have costs that are much higher are funds that are sold by financial companies on the market to individuals. So basically it's the personal pension market, is the market for personal pensions. There is no fiduciary role, so there is no one that, how could I say, takes the side of workers to negotiate with financial intermediaries what are the best conditions. So the conclusion of this part of my comments is that what you really need to make individual accounts work is somebody that plays a fiduciary role. And this can be done at industry level, as it is done in Italy. We have very good experience on that, very positive results. I believe it can be done as well at the level of the nation as a whole. So I do like, actually, the centralized model that the State Commission is proposing. What I would also share as a conclusion with Nikola is that it doesn't work if you do not have this fiduciary role and you just leave to competition play the game. Just because there is too much asymmetry, too much information asymmetry between the workers that should look at what are the opportunities, should compare prices, should compare fees, but at the end, doesn't matter how much you push on education, this is not going to work, and this actually does not work also for very advanced and industrialized and economies like number of ones within Western countries. So I really think that this is a very, very important aspect. Let me say there is also another experience that is working very well in the Western world, that is the experience of auto-enrollment in the UK. In the UK also, on the top of kind of basic and low level of public pensions, they introduced this automatic enrollment for all workers in 5-6 years ago, and it is working very well because, again, there is a fiduciary role of employers that on behalf of their employees look at what are the offers, say, by a different kind of pension plans that are sold in the UK financial markets, and they select the ones that are really convenient for the workers. There is also another element in the UK market that somehow goes in the direction of having a role at the national level for the state. They basically encourage the introduction of one pension plan that is called a nest. You may know that was actually introduced by initiative of the government, but it works as a private initiative with the standards, with the quality standards of a private initiatives, but with the aim of keeping costs low, because that is the main precondition, I would say, for the market for supplementary pensions work. So I would say I would very much go in favor of the decentralized model for Ukraine. I would not be pessimistic in the role that supplementary pensions, funded pensions, may play for Ukraine. What I want to emphasize is that there is a consensus that multi-pillar systems where you have a pay-as-you-go component and a funded component, these systems are more resilient to shocks, to uncertain developments for the future than models that are based only on one component, either if this is only the pay-as-you-go component or the funded component. So I do encourage Ukraine to go for building a second pillar, also for another reason that is in place for Ukraine, that demographics go very much in that direction. When you have the prospects of having a decrease in population, it is very important that you have a system where you balance somehow the pay-as-you-go component with a funded component, because obviously in the future, both for the fertility rate that is low in Ukraine as in other countries, and for immigration that you also have, you are going to have a number of workers that is going to be lower than now, and they will, and if you go only for a pay-as-you-go system, you might go into serious trouble in the future decades. So I do recommend to go for the building a funded component for the pension system, but again, the precondition is to keep costs low. And the way that I envisage as the most promising is the one that was suggested by the State Commission, and to have a centralized system where basically it is the state that plays that fiduciary role that I'm emphasizing, in fiduciary role in favor of workers and of future pensioners. Just one final word. It's also very important to have sustained and continued political consensus that has to stay in place for many years to come. So it is important that you try hard to get consensus on one proposal, and I would say the only one proposal that may fly that I see on the table is the one from the State Commission.
Thank you. And so we logically came to the issue which is heavily debated. What is, I would say, the best concept? Because the main difference, if we look at the both concepts, is the, I would say, infrastructure. Should it be centralized or decentralized is the main topic of discussion. And I'd like to give a floor to Volodymyr in order to give the analysis what is the best fit for Ukraine. Volodymyr, please, you've made a lot of work on that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Grigoriy. I have a privilege to be the last speaker, and I do know by publications all over 3 international guests, and I would like firstly to tell that I've been a member of the Cabinet of Ministers Pension Reform Task Force since 1997, so I do remember the whole pension reform history in Ukraine. As a member of the pension reform team, so we organized lots of conferences, seminars, international pension study tours. We studied many countries' experiences to include Poland, Hungary, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Croatia, Bulgaria, and the Netherlands, Sweden, United Kingdom, US, etc. And finally, in 2003, we ended up with the centralized second pillar model, because that was some sort of consensus based on already existed centralized systems experience, like in Sweden, for example. And Bolivia also provided some good guidance, so to speak. Because if you look at the pension systems, private pension systems typology, you can start with one extreme, which is the Singapore Central Provident Fund, where the government makes everything, collects contributions, invests money, and pays pension benefits, and also Singapore Provident Fund also covers housing needs and health insurance. And another extreme is the Australian superannuation system, which is highly decentralized, and then the Chilean or Latin American system stays very close to the Australian. And most other systems are in between, because even, for example, in Poland or in Estonia, there is a centralized contribution collection. So that's why they do save some money, because of economies of scale. And to understand which system would work better, you should always keep in mind, even if you work for the financial sector, but if you put yourself in future retiree shoes or suits, because everybody is a future pensioner, right? Then you should keep in mind that your future retirement benefit from the mandatory retirement savings will depend on 4 key factors. Firstly, contribution rate and your employment career wage path. Contribution rate is set up by politicians, usually in the law, and your employment career wage path is one of the biggest unpredictables. Nobody can predict whom you will be in 20 years from now, whether you will be employed full-time or unemployed. The second factor is contribution density, which is connected to the previous one. You should make contributions regularly, not just for 1, 2, 3, 5 years. The minimum should be close to 30 years, except if you are top manager, probably 20 years will be enough. But usually top managers that don't need forced saving, because they are very highly paid, they receive great bonuses, and they have lots of savings. Then investment return. Investment return is as unpredictable as your employment career. Nobody, only that office can predict, but they don't disclose this information for us. And the fourth factor, so the previous 3 factors, they moves your retirement capital up, and the fourth factor, that's administrative costs. This is what reduces your capital. And then we go to understanding how the mandatory retirement savings quasi-market works. It's not a typical market. Both supply and demand side are very specific. From the supply side, pension services provided by the pension companies is characterized by large fixed costs and the economies of scale. Economies of scale firstly related to such services like contribution collection, record keeping of individual accounts, communications with beneficiaries, with customers, marketing, treasury operations or transaction costs. The economies of scale does work as well for instance, asset management as for these administrative functions. And then payment of annuities does have a great economy of scale. So that's why, since cost does matter, in Sweden during 1990s, after long debates, after reaching political consensus, which is extremely important between 5 major parties in the Swedish Riksdag, Swedish parliament, they put 2 major goals when justifying why Sweden needs relatively small mandatory retirement savings to top up their mandatory notional defined contribution pay-as-you-go or solidarity system. Why to top up? Because the contribution is very small, it's 2.5%. And when I personally talk to Swedish pension reformers, they simply explain, we Swedes, we consider this PPM, premium pension system, as a dessert on top of the solidarity pay-as-you-go system. So their number 1 goal, minimize the cost. You can see this everywhere in all publications, in the Swedish pension agency reports, and I visited that agency, and I saw firsthand. And the second goal, provide investment opportunity for investment choice. So they did succeed with minimizing the cost, and currently the total administrative cost last year in the Swedish PPM system, they consider as a part of the first pillar, but this is mandatory retirement savings, it's less than 0.5%. It's 35 basis points. It's 0.35. It's 10 times less than is proposed in one of our draft bills. And however, at the same time, it's higher than, for example, if and when you will invest into global index funds. For example, if you go to the Yahoo Finance, you will see that there is a Vanguard S&P Standard Poor's 500 that charges 10 times less, 0.04, 4 basis points. This fund has $450 billion in assets under management, and they do use economies of scale. However, probably many of you saw this report that our project prepared, and it shows this back page. No pension system is immune from that demography and economy. If the economy reminds you of a roller coaster, it's very difficult to either pay the pay-as-you-go pensions or do retirement savings. The Ukrainian economy should be first stabilized. Inflation should be lower than double digits. And then you can start saving. So on this chart clearly provides you the difference between different fees. The upper curve shows if you will invest 10,000 hryvnia for 40 years, paying 0 fees, you will be on the upper curve. If you will pay 0.5%, you will be on the second dark blue curve. And if you will pay 3.5%, you will get 3 times less accumulated pension capital. This is especially relevant because when it comes to initial investment, assuming if the second pillar in Ukraine will be introduced within the next several years, the first question is, okay, you collected money, where are you going to invest that money? And unfortunately, the investment instruments are very limited. Predominantly, they will be invested into government securities and bank deposits. But for that type of money market instruments, you don't need any intermediary. You don't need asset manager. You don't need a pension fund administrator. What do you need to do, especially if you are buying government securities? You just need to reflect in the accounting. You just need to shift this money from one treasury account to another treasury account. This is what the US federal government thrift savings plan doing when investing participants' money into index G fund, government securities fund. They don't hire any asset manager. And to run for other index funds, they recruited on the tender basis the BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world. And then over time, as soon as our stock market will be developed, then we can, the centralized system administrator can recruit asset manager to invest into Ukrainian stock and bonds. But at the beginning, some portion of funds can be invested into international, I would strongly recommend international index funds. And finally, when we are talking centralization, decentralization, we should rather, and it will be more correct to talk about between centralization and concentration. Because if you look at these markets, 5 countries, Chile including, which is the godmother of all this system, that over time the market became concentrated and 2 or 3 companies concentrated the entire market, receiving about normal profits and charging higher than in the centralized system fees. So thank you very much for the attention.
So finally, at the end, what would you recommend from your point of view?
I would definitely recommend the centralized record-keeping system and with private asset management with a limited choice. So on that previous chart, there is no box, for example, I don't remember. Start.
You need to point it in the other direction.
Okay. There is no, for example, box about default fund, but you can create a default fund as a combination of these funds, because at the very beginning, the overwhelming majority of money will go to the government securities, maybe bank deposits, and maybe some international investment. Like in Sweden, Swedish AP7 default fund is overperforming other mutual funds or investment funds. There are more than 800 funds, and each member can pick up to 5 funds among 800, which is too much, So, but their default fund, and currently the latest trend is 98% of Swedes, they make no choice. So they automatically go to the default fund, and default fund has 2 portfolios. stock portfolio and bonds portfolio. If you are younger than 55 years and you go automatically to default fund, all your money goes to the equities fund. And when you reach 55, so they reduce the percentage of equities in your portfolio and put more bonds. And when you reach your age 75, you will have portfolio that will comprise of 60% equities and 40% bonds. But again, the reason why still at 75 years, 60% having equity is still too high. But the reason Swiss do that, because remember, they call their system premium pensions deserved, because it doesn't make the big picture, because this is a supplement to the major pension benefit that they receive from the first bill.
Thank you. We're short of time, so the final round of the quick, I would say, question and answers. So at the end, we all want to know the opinion, whether Ukraine is ready, because it's 15 years passed from the start of the discussion, and we're still at the same, I would say, place we still discuss that. So finally, what is your opinion? I mean, quickly, whether Ukraine is ready or not, and the reform should be postponed for the better time. And I'd like to ask start from the Olexandr. What is your opinion?
My opinion is clear. We are ready, and let's start to do this. That's the main question for me. As I have listened to Dariusz and Nikola, and I would like to ask them about: do we have any decision for the situation when the system would be cut it, or reduce it, or even privatize it? Do we have any solutions that we need to take on the board when we draft the law? Would you propose anything in this way?
Well, it has to be, legally speaking, it has to be private property. Of course, it is not guarantee, but it's something that might prevent. But in economic terms, really, if you cannot move one thing from one pocket to another, if you don't solve the unfunded pillar problems, having funded pillar is a bit risky, because sooner or later, if there's a really need for the public finance, there might be some tensions, let's say. Maybe the property might not be taken, but then there might be some extra tax or some sort of action. So I would say it has to be both sides. It has to be, as Ambrogio was also saying, there are two pillars to consider, and in terms of financing, but also in terms of reforming. So I would say that probably you should work very hard to get the agreement on the proposal of the bill for the funded pillar, because it looks like it will never happen if you still debate it. It's been a while, yes, but you also have to start work on the holistic pension reform as well. Thank you.
Nikola?
I also completely agree, and I have to say that I strongly believe that you should pull the brake, and that your experts and then your representatives of Ukrainian people should have broad political support for something that has strong economic foundations. Now, for the political support, of course, I won't comment, but on economic foundations, I would like to basically echo what Dariusz and Ambrogio was saying. Of course, from an operational point of view, there is very little doubt that from an expert point of view, it should be centralized. But this is only one aspect, and maybe even peripheral aspect to a few other unresolved issues that I have noticed. One of them, as Ambrogio was saying, is this fiduciary role. So people are not pension experts, are not financial experts, and all over the Eastern Europe, they were basically tricked, not tricked in the sense of embezzlement, but basically with false beliefs, like Dariusz said, about unrealistic expectations. And the only way to get this is to get some kind of fiduciary law. Now, in developed economies, or better to say developed societies, employers can play this role. In Eastern Europe, it's still probably unrealistic from employers to play this role, and this is why you have to have government step in. Now, I know this is unpopular in Eastern Europe. None of us probably has much trust in the government, but this is the only way. And we were talking about this default fund in Sweden. So this is, I wouldn't say you can have this. This is a completely game changer, and there's to how the system operates. Nobel Prize winner Peter Diamond published a paper only a couple of months ago showing, for example, why this automatic distribution mechanism that you're considering and that Australia is considering will not work. You have to go with one single default like in the Sweden, and this will provide protection to many people who are basically unable to choose wisely. And last but not least, what Dariusz was saying, you have to have the holistic approach to integrate this with the first pillar, because like it or not, the first pillar will remain dominant.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ambrogio.
No, I echo what Nikola was saying. Again, I think you are ready, except for one thing. Strong, convinced, wide political consensus. What would be a problem is to go for a reform that has the support of 51, 55%, even 60 maybe is not enough. What is really important is that the reform is not reversed, not only for technical reason that I hope you overcome. So if you have a centralized model that looks at costs with a good default option that is the core of the fiduciary role, the technical issues might be fixed. But if it is reversed only for political reasons, that would be really a risk that I would see. It happens in a number of situations. For example, in Italy, we have had a very good reform of the first pillar recently. And now with this new government, they are talking about reforming that would be very unfortunate. One thing on the first pillar, that an element that was not mentioned that I think is very important. I think you did a good job in raising the retirement age and in bringing contribution rate to a reasonable feasible level of 22% all included, that gives some room for contribution to funded pillar. Otherwise, if you had the 35 or something that you had before, there was no room for extra contributions. One thing that you could do is to introduce the indexation of the retirement age to life expectancy, because Ukraine will have an increase of life expectancy for sure in the future years. But this may become a problem for pensions. You should start introducing an automatic mechanism to increase the retirement age if and when your life expectancy will rise significantly, as it has happened in everywhere, basically.
Thank you.
Here. Thank you.
Vladimir, just a few words.
Yeah, I would like to add that after the 2008 global financial crisis, I don't know any single country in the world that introduced a decentralized model. Moreover, the number of countries that are following the Swedish experience is growing. Armenia last year, Georgia next year, the Ireland just published pension reform roadmap, and Ireland is planning to introduce centralized Swedish type of model in 2022. So not to mention this UK NES, National Employment Savings Trust, this is a prototype of a centralized model with a default. So centralization plus limited investment choice in using default funds.
Thank you, Roman. Чи має Рада
Whether the parliament
політичну волю
has the political
прийняти
will,
Інфраструктури України
whether the
готова.
parliament has the political will. As for the infrastructure, I think that Ukraine is ready, but we need to provide guarantees. So after the decrease of the rate, I think that we have the resource where to get it from, but from the political process, not a single one will increase the burden onto the enterprises or the people before the elections. It is just not real, because we are now in the electoral process already. And now I'm deeply sure that this reform is not done by the parliament, it's done by the government. Because in any case, this is not popular, because there won't be an effect for the wider audience in the short-term perspective. So I do hope that the most visible out of the political momentum will be the new government. So it should issue this process during the first half a year, but it's not real during the next year. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for the useful comments. We can list thanks to you all and thanks to the participants of the panel.